Uruguay, South America in the summer of 1930. Spectators and teams from all over the world arrive for an international event never held before, the first Football World Cup. 100,000 people fill Montevideo's new stadium. The huge crowds are part of a new phenomenon, mass sport. In the 20th century, sport becomes more than just a game. It becomes a business and a focus for national prestige as the excitement and passion it brings to people's lives is increasingly exploited. Sport was still at an innocent stage when the Olympics were held in London 20 years earlier in 1908. The leader in the marathon staggered in and collapsed just before the finish. But officials were kind enough to pick him up and help him across the line. Archery was one of the few events for women. There was no danger of body contact. Olympic sport was still a pastime for the gifted amateur. It didn't matter how many spectators were in the stands. But behind the amateur gentility, there were already signs of rougher times to come. In the tug of war, the Americans accused the English of cheating because their team wore spikes on their boots. 1908 was the first Olympics in which competitors entered as members of national teams rather than as individuals. Soon national rivalry, the urge to win, and the professionalism that followed would transform sport. When the troops came home in 1918, the world was changing fast. In America, they returned to a civilian life where wages were higher. And with working hours reduced, people had more leisure. On the continent of Europe, the fastest growing professional sport was cycle racing, which took the thrills out to the people in the towns and villages. The Tour de France had been run since the turn of the century, and the number of riders increased as fast as the prize money. In France, le vélo was king, but people were watching more sport of all kinds. In Britain, tennis attracted a growing middle class. The popular press built up the players as personalities, though they were still amateurs. 20-year-old Suzanne Lenglen was the first major tennis star. So many wanted to see her that all her games had to be played on the center court. Lenglen added a new ingredient to spectator sport in the 1920s, sex appeal. She cast off her corsets and changed the game's image forever. She eventually turned professional and made a fortune from her popularity. Full commercialism came most rapidly in boxing. In 1921, a fight in America showed just how much money could be made from the public's growing appetite. A barroom brawler from the American West, Jack Dempsey, the Manassas Mauler, was set to fight a French war hero named Georges Carpentier. Tex Rickard, the promoter, found backers to put up the unheard-of stake of $500,000 for the World Heavyweight Championship. No existing stadium was big enough for the number of customers Rickard needed to make the fight pay. So he built his own in a New Jersey field to be used just once. The promoter used the press as no one had before. He drove journalists into a frenzy of publicity for the fight of the century. Special trains brought in the crowds. Among them was a local butcher and his 12-year-old shop assistant, Joe Liguori.
He had promised me a couple of weeks before that he was going to take me to the fight. And I was all excited about it, you know what I mean? I had never been, at that age, I've never been to a fight.
All the promotion paid off. Admission prices ran up to $50, the highest ever charged.
They expected a big crowd, and they got the crowd too. Boy, believe me, the whole stadium was just packed. People were saying, my God, if this thing ever collapses, you know, there'll be a catastrophe here. 90,000 people in a wooden stadium. You know, every time they got up to cheer, everything sort of shook a little bit, you know.
In the end, the fight of the century was a great spectacle, but a short one. The fight only lasted as far as the fourth round, when Carpentier was counted out. The successful promotion of the Dempsey fight was mass sport in its newest form. It made hundreds of thousands of dollars and provided irresistible theater for the public. At the center of the stage was Dempsey, the hero who'd been seen to rise from nothing to fame and fortune. It was an American dream. In Britain, after the First War, the prospects for grand sporting spectaculars with high ticket prices weren't promising. People had less to spend on sport or anything else. Billy O'Donnell worked in Liverpool.
Squalor, disease, bad days, vermin, oh, it was terrible. How they can call them good days, I don't know.
But for most working people, there was one bright spot in the week. Football. In 1900, there had been only a handful of professional teams. By the 1920s, there were more than 80. The game had become an essential part of many people's lives.
Football was always football in Liverpool, nothing else. We were looking forward to Saturday coming. A working man, if he was working, would be 12 o'clock. Knock off, half day Saturday, lunch, maybe if he had a couple of bob, meet his pals in the local, but either walk up or get the tram car, get up there for 2:45 maybe, ready for the kick-off.
Oh, I do like to see a game of football, and Sunday afternoon comes round. It's blue rain when they break away.
Football was so important for everybody.
Oh, I do like to see a game of football.
When you went in the corner of the street or anything like that, if you couldn't talk about football, well, what do you talk about? You know, that was the idea.
And we'd meet there every Saturday, and if anyone was missing, they'd say, yeah, it was so-and-so, you know, we didn't live near you. Just knew him as Jack or George. Where's George? He must be sick or something. You were missed, you know. Well, that went on all over the cop.
In all weathers, they turned out to stand packed together on the terraces. The clubs took the supporters who paid at the gate for granted and spent little to make them comfortable.
You couldn't get back for the toilet, see. Some of them would go in after a few points and they thought where they were. But we used to roll the newspaper up, you know, so, make a funnel so it wouldn't splash on anyone. But if you were at the bottom, pair of Wellingtons or nothing, you know, or you were, you were walking ankle deep.
The sense of community which bound the supporters together was almost tribal. It united small towns with their own clubs and brought passionate divisions to big cities with rival teams. Sidney Garner supported West Ham United, one of 11 league clubs in London.
This is my hat, this is my scarf, the two West Ham colours. Wherever they play and wherever we went, it was our gear. And now, one of our songs we used to sing was the theme song of West Ham's. So I'm forever blowing bubbles. Went something like this. I am forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. They fly so high, nearly reach the sky. Then like my dreams, they fade and die. Fortune's always hiding. I've looked everywhere. I'm forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. Honey, and it's still there.
In 1923, Sidney Garner's team got through to the Cup final to meet Bolton Wanderers in the new stadium being built at Wembley in northwest London. With football attendances rising rapidly, Wembley had been designed to hold 127,000. To prepare for these numbers, the engineers tested the terraces with sandbags. Then they called in regiments of workmen to reproduce the shocks and vibrations of a crowd in full cry. But the stadium still wasn't big enough. On the day of the Cup final, 200,000 arrived at Wembley. Among the West Ham supporters hoping to get in was the 18-year-old Sidney Garner.
When we was approaching Wembley, we made our way towards the main gates. And there was literally thousands and thousands of people. And then we heard them say they've closed the gates. And all of a sudden, there was a surge at the back, fences went down, we were literally jumping over obstacles, and a lot of people fell, got trampled on. A pal of mine nearly got choked. He had a tie on, and his tie got caught. So he was one of the turnstiles or somewhere, and as the crowd was pushing, he was choking, but his tie split, luckily. You know, what a thought, isn't it?
The scenes at Wembley were a chaotic demonstration of the fever mass sport could arouse. As the barricades fell, the crowd outside poured onto the pitch. Before play could begin, mounted police had to clear them to the touchlines. It was the clearest evidence so far of football's huge and growing popularity.
You know, Khan trying to hit away from Dean.
In the 1920s, millions more were attracted to sport as the wireless came into people's homes. To help listeners follow football over the air, the BBC divided the pitch into numbered squares, printed in the Radio Times.
Middle of the goal, there it goes, snap in the middle of the goal.
7,
Ken's head is there, got it away.
8,
Ball comes out to Britain. Britain manoeuvres, centres, goes right in.
Back to
Langford fists out. Comes on to Marshall.
6.
Marshall clears. Oh, terror, dear Marshall. Taking a flying, last despairing.
Whole new businesses latched onto the game and made money from it. They sold football books, special magazines, comics and games. And with most forms of gambling still restricted, there was another reason to follow the results: the pools.
By far, England's newest and most lucrative business is the gambling on the matches. Weekly, 3 million Britishers take sixpenny chances on their ability to pick the winners. As thousands of people find that with only enough money for a postage stamp in their pockets, they can still take a little flyer on credit, the industry grows by leaps and bounds. Even the government profits by an institution it has tried to discourage, as post office receipts boom under an unprecedented flood of money orders. Hundreds of tons of mail a day.
In the United States, the game of baseball was promoted with growing efficiency. Special indicator boards relayed the excitement of the World Series, annual high point of the national game across the country. Americans learned baseball from childhood. Bill Werber grew up with the game.
Sandlot baseball. And that's why we played all summer long. It was not organized ball. It was not sponsored by anybody. We earned the money, bought our balls, bought our bats. Our parents bought our gloves. So baseball was the game, and all of the kids had their own individual heroes, and we felt ourselves very fortunate if upon occasion we were taken to see a game. I loved the way these people walked. I loved the way they swung the bat. I was thoroughly enamored of the grace in their movements and fielding and throwing the baseball. It was altogether a pretty good experience.
Baseball had grown since the 1870s, when the first professional teams had been formed. In the 1920s, the owners began adjusting the game to bring in still more spectators, including women.
They were trying to get women interested in baseball, which they did. And I think the atmosphere at the ball game was very, very exciting. You had great times rooting. You could say almost anything you wanted. You never heard anything said that was very vulgar. You might call an umpire a bum.
Anna Freund and her sister grew up near Yankee Stadium in New York.
We would go to ball games rather than the movies. And the way we were punished, my worst punishment was to say you cannot go to the ball game.
One skill more than any other drew thousands of new spectators. Players who could make one great hit into the stands and then get round all three bases and back to the plate with a home run. And owners made sure it now happened more often by introducing a harder ball. One player built his reputation on his home runs and became a legend in the 1920s and 30s, Babe Ruth.
Oh, Babe Ruth, he won't lose that ball, and that's the truth. There is not a player in the land who can hit a ball like Babe Ruth can. If two men are on base, don't throw near the plate, for if you do, he'll knock it about a mile. And if the pitcher throws one across the plate, he's a home run guy with a smile.
Ruth, here's your contract for $80,000 for 2 years. Will you kindly sign your name?
All right, Colonel.
Ruth was the orphan who shook hands with the great and earned more than they did. He was the most popular hero in a new age of sporting heroes. Ruth was a glutton and a drinker, but his obvious flaws endeared him to his fans. When the Yankees signed Bill Werber as a young professional, he soon gained direct experience of the myth.
I was in the shower one time, and the warm water was coming down on my face, and I was lathering my shoulders and arms and stomach and one thing with the warm water and the soap, and I felt a hot stream in the middle of my back, and I wondered how the water in my back could be hotter than the water in my eye. And I turned around, and there was Ruth using the middle of my back as a urinal. And I turned around, and he was enjoying himself, so there wasn't anything for me to do but to enjoy myself too. And I felt, well, I said, looks like I'm being accepted.
In England's bat and ball game, the professionals earned far less and had a different style. The great Jack Hobbs was modest and shy about his fame. Playing for Surrey and England, Hobbs broke all cricket's records and was idolised.
Directly you knew Hobbs was batting. Off we all went. We might be playing cricket in the streets as we were in those days, with a wicket against the wall, but our game of cricket would go and we would all run up the over to watch Jack Hobbs bat. He must have put 1,000 people on the gate if he was batting.
It used to be sixpence to go in after the tea interval at the Oval and sit on the grass. We were really squashed. And of course there was no terraces then. It was just wooden benches with no backs. And it was most uncomfortable really, but we didn't notice that because we were so enthralled.
On one occasion when Surrey were going off, we rushed up to pat him on the back, and that was really something. When we went home and told our mum and dad that we'd patted the great Jack Hobbs on the back.
The nearest most got to their gods was through collecting the cards given away with every packet of cigarettes, as the tobacco companies used the interest in sport to promote their own sales. By now, cricket was played throughout the British Empire, in the Caribbean and in India, and it took firm root in Australia. In the regular series played against England for the Ashes, the Australians produced a succession of their own heroes. None had more impact than a brilliant young batsman from New South Wales.
Who is it that all Australia raves about? Who has won our very highest praise? Now is it Amy Johnson or little Mickey Mouse? No, it's just a country lad who's bringing down the house, and he's our Don Bradman. Now I ask you, is he any good? Our Don Bradman, every Aussie dipped his lid to you.
The Ashes assumed a new significance in 1932 when the English team introduced controversial tactics to try and deal with Bradman. They left for Australia with a plan. Jardine, the England captain, intended to exploit the high-speed bowling of one of his players, ex-coal miner Harold Larwood.
Mr. Larwood, when we get to Australia, we shan't forget the good wishes of those who've been kind enough to come and see us all. And we hope that you will do as they hope we will do, and return with the Ashes.
In a game that had prided itself on its gentility, Jardine took an uncompromising approach to victory. His methods brought a new division to popular sport.
Saturday, the 15th of January, 1933, in the third test match between England and Australia, the record crowd of 50,962 cricket fans yelled "Blue Murder." The bodyline balloon exploded. MCC skipper Douglas Jardine brought his three big guns, Larwood, Allen and Boast, to bear on the Australian batsmen. They dropped them short on the leg stump, Larwood hurtling the ball down at 90 miles an hour.
What shocked people about Larwood's bowling was that he aimed at the batsman's body rather than the stumps. Bradman found it difficult, but that was just the start of it.
It was hit or get hit, and Australia's captain, Billy Woodfull, got hit.
In the stands was 18-year-old Cess Starr.
Jardine was the man they were blaming more than anybody else. The crowd started pelting him with orange peel and anything of a nature, anything that they could throw of that type. And it was so bad, got so bad, that he was only there for an over or two and he had to shift himself and go back to his original position.
Another bumper from Larwood, and the ball crashed into Oldfield's temple.
The controversy went far beyond the cricket field. Politicians joined the row. Trade between England and Australia was threatened as sport sent national temperatures soaring.
Oldfield retired hurt, 41.
The air became, well, you could feel it, volatile, electric. It would only need one man, one person, I feel, to have jumped the fence, and there could have been a very serious situation.
The deadly enmity which had developed is best described by the cable sent to the MCC in London by the Australian Board of Control. It read, "Bodyline bowling assumed such proportions as to menace best interests of the game. In our opinion, it is unsportsmanlike, and unless stopped at once is likely to upset friendly relations existing between Australia and England."
It could have been the end of Test cricket, really. I mean, they still think it was cheating. Well, it may have been cheating in a way, but then there's always some ploy that is used, I suppose, to win.
As football spread round the world, it raised its own fervour and controversy. It was now played and watched in more countries than any other game. Around Europe, sports papers built huge circulations covering the game. In Italy's Gazzetta dello Sport, readers followed teams, many of which were owned by big companies. In France, they read about the two Paris teams, Racing and Stade Francais, Bordeaux and Marseille, and many more. Germany's sports weekly was called Der Kicker. The people's game had crossed national barriers. In the cities of South America, football was taken up with more zeal than anywhere else, feeding nationalist fervour. Uruguay had grown wealthy selling beef. When the British came to build the railways, they brought football too.
The children of the English brought the first balls, boots and uniforms. It was a novelty. People called it the game of the crazy English because they wore shorts. It was very odd, shorts. The local kids watched them and started imitating the players. They began to think they could do better.
Diego Lucero played as a boy and went on to become a professional. In his lifetime, football was taken up all over South America. Great rivalries built up, especially between Uruguay, a small country of only 2 million people, and its bigger neighbor across the River Plate, Argentina.
The international matches between Argentina and Uruguay were great social gatherings. The ladies came all dressed up. The President of the Republic and ministers and so on. It was a real diplomatic event.
Europeans knew little of Uruguay's prize until they surprised everyone by winning the gold medal at the Olympics twice in the 1920s. Increasingly, their national morale was tied to their success in football.
It brought great honor to the country and great benefit. People across the world began to look at their maps to see where Uruguay was. Without a doubt, what the footballers did was a great thing for the country.
The huge following for football in South America was confirmed when Uruguay's bid to hold the first ever World Cup in 1930 was accepted. The Uruguayans rushed up a brand new stadium. England, founders of the modern game, haughtily boycotted the Cup, but 13 national teams arrived. And what mattered most in Montevideo were local rivalries. Only months before the championship, Argentina had beaten Uruguay and proclaimed themselves world champions. Ondino Vieira, a Uruguayan coach, remembers the outrage caused by this presumption.
It was a declaration of war. The championship developed into a psychological war between Uruguay and Argentina. It led to the breakdown of diplomatic relations between the two countries.
The climax came in the final, when the two South American neighbors faced each other for the World Championship, not merely as teams, but as countries.
All around the stadium was a multitude of people who couldn't get in. There were lots of police. It was a climate of virtual war, a football war.
It was a terrible thing, a struggle, hard. The match was a battle.
At half-time, we were losing 2-1. The Argentinians thought they'd won the World Cup.
In the second half, Uruguay came back and scored 3 goals. The first World Cup was theirs.
The enthusiasm seized everyone. Men, women and children poured out of the stadium onto the streets. The whole night long they celebrated the championship.
Uruguayan pride and national feeling was boosted for generations to come. It was therefore no wonder that other governments began systematic attempts to work the same sporting magic for themselves. Soviet Russia had stayed out of Olympic competition and international sport. But Stalin used sport for its full propaganda effect within the USSR itself. Athletes were meant to inspire the new society and help unite the far-flung republics. Fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini spent government money to build up sport and made his national teams a weapon of foreign policy. His footballers gave him the results he wanted when they won the next 2 World Cups held after Montevideo. But no one was to exploit the full political potential of sport better than Adolf Hitler. In Mein Kampf, he wrote, "Give the German nation 6 million bodies of flawless athletic training, and in less than 2 years, we will have created an army." The German sportsman who received most world attention was their heavyweight boxer, Max Schmeling. At first, Schmeling showed no interest in politics. And the Nazis complained that he was demeaning the white race when he agreed to fight the 22-year-old Joe Louis, the brown bomber, the leading American heavyweight.
Say, man, did you finally arrive? Hey, let's go, Joe. He's nothing doing but the soul and soul.
Joe Louis had done much to overcome the racial discrimination in American boxing. By 1936, he'd defeated every serious heavyweight contender except Schmeling.
He just had so much ability. It's sensational. The hopes of a group of people rolled on his shoulders.
And may I respectfully think that the thought uppermost in your mind and the sincere feeling in your heart be that regardless of race, creed, or color, let us all say and mean it, may the better men emerge victorious.
The build-up for the Louis-Schmeling fight took it beyond boxing.
And they're still out there in the center of the ring, Schmeling backing away cautiously, waiting for some opening that he wants. And Schmeling got over and high on Lewis's jaw that made Lewis rock his head. Schmeling has sent Lewis down. Lewis is down.
Over that 12 rounds that the fight lasted, Joe got hit with 60 right hands.
Lewis is down, hanging to the rope, howling badly. The fight is over. The fight is over, and Schmeling is the winner.
That was one of the saddest days in this country I've ever seen. It was like a great president had died. The people just couldn't believe it. Just couldn't believe it.
Max Schmeling returned to Germany in triumph.
Homeward the Hindenburg, Max Schmeling, and this address of welcome hails him in the name of the German people.
Deutschen Volkes in Amerika gekämpft haben.
The Nazis now embraced him as one of their own. The emergence of a new German hero came as a stroke of luck for the Nazis. What followed was far more deliberate. In the summer of 1936, international athletes converged on Germany for the 11th Olympics in Berlin. It was a far cry from the naivety of London 30 years before. The athletes were about to take part in one of the most carefully orchestrated propaganda events of the century. Robert Mitchell was a member of England's water polo team.
We were taken straight off to the Olympic Village, and obviously it was a beautiful village in this pine forest, and I think we were all pretty impressed by what we saw. We tried to pretend to the Germans that we weren't, but I think we really were.
18-year-old American runner Helen Stevens was a farmer's daughter.
It was a sort of a shock to go from America in a Depression time
and to go over there to Germany and find that they were seemingly living pretty good, and it was a police state. Troops were everywhere.
German highboard champs display their talent, which looks okey-doke, but hold everything. The Army is muscled in with full pack and steel helmets. How cute. Is this a raid, or is he a Marine?
The opening was a carefully staged spectacle to lend a glow of Olympian majesty to the Third Reich. Outside, the torch was nearing the end of its relay run from Greece. Its arrival would be the climax. "20-year-old Fritz Schilgen was chosen to carry the flame on the final leg into the stadium. Schilgen would be the living symbol of the Olympian spirit, and at the same time of the Aryan ideal. His blonde, blue-eyed looks helped win him the role.
Everything was done to make the whole affair most effective. Naturally, in the climate of 1936, I wasn't selected just for my running style.
Nicht der Lauf steht allein entscheidend. war es ohne Zweifel.
1936 was without any doubt an opportunity to show off. That also meant showing what was behind it.
Was dahinter steht. Eine einheitliche, vermeintliche.
A united, supposedly united way of thinking. I believe only a few of the sportsmen were aware of this.
Den Sportlern in wenigsten Fällen bewusst waren.
For the German leaders, each medal won helped to justify the investment made and bring respectability. The German athletes were soldiers on the propaganda battlefield. Nationalism was in the air and in the water.
Playing water polo, now when we started a game, certain countries, particularly if Hitler was there, would line up in front of Hitler and all give the Nazi salute in the water. The whole team would line up. And we sort of stood and lounged against the goalpost at the other end, you see, and tried to look as lounging as we could, you see.
The British water polo team wasn't a serious threat to the Nazi scenario, but the black athletes from the United States were, and they dominated events, both on the field and track. Jesse Owens led the way with 4 gold medals.
The competition was grand, and we're very glad to come out on top. Thank you very kindly.
The success of the black athletes was hard for the Nazis to accept. Hitler's failure to congratulate Owens was widely reported in America. But a victory by a white American woman was treated quite differently.
In the ladies' 100-meter final, a glimpse of America's Helen Stevens, who developed her speed chasing rabbits on a Missouri farm. And here you see her, winging her way to a new universal mark of 11 5/10 seconds, while the greatest proud Olympic history salutes another member of the Star-Spangled Brigade of gold medal champions.
After the American girls' win, Hitler summoned her back to his private box.
I said, I believe Hitler's going to shoot me because I see some of those black shirts coming in here and they're testing their Lugers, pulling them in now, their holsters. And then they arrayed themselves around the room, and then Hitler came in, accompanied by an interpreter, and gave us a sloppy salute. And I didn't return it. I gave him a good old Missouri handshake, and I put extra pressure on it, and that gave him the wrong message, because he began to hug me and pinch me and squeeze me and see if I was real. And he said, how about spending the weekend with me in Burgerstown? That was his mountain retreat.
Helen Stevens declined the invitation.
Then he wished me well and hugged me again, pinched me and left.
Hitler had impressed the world, successfully blending National Socialist ideals with Olympic images. Germany basked, for the moment at least, in the reflected glory. As the 1936 Olympics came to a close, the power of the stage management was hard to resist.
The lights were coming down and the Olympic flame went out, and then there was utter silence and utter darkness, and it really was most impressive. And then they started Sieg Heil, and that was when 100,000 people were going Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, and I literally put my hands in my pocket, literally, to stop myself being hypnotized into doing it with them. It was absolutely hypnotic.
Two years later, Joe Louis and Max Schmeling were about to enter the ring once more. All of the forces that defined 20th century sport, promotion, money, nationalism, and propaganda, now came together in a single event. The heavyweight crown was at stake, and Joe Louis had a chance to redeem the single failure of his professional career. Beyond the ring, the stakes were even higher. Hitler had started on the road to war in Europe. To many, Schmeling seemed a potent symbol of Nazi aggression. To followers in the United States, it now mattered more that Louis was American than that he was black.
It was a new and great feeling. He was the representative of all America. All America.
In June 1938, millions of people in America and Europe were riveted to the drama unfolding in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the biggest show on earth. Joe Louis, the world's heavyweight champion, versus Max Schmeling, Germany's contender. Broadcast by Buick, direct from the ringside of the Yankee Stadium, New York City. The commentators, Clem McCarthy and Ed Torgerson.
We give you now Clem McCarthy. And she's about to start with this Yankee Stadium packed to the doors. There isn't an empty seat. And they're ready with a bell just about to ring. And there we are. Joe Louis is in the center of the ring. Max going around. Joe Louis left kick with two straight lefts to the chin. Both of them light shot as the men clinch. And Louis missed with a left swing, but in close front of a hard right overcut. And a right to the jaw. And again, a right to the body. A left hook. A right to the head. A left to the head. A right. Bailey is going down. But he held to his feet, held to the rope. Donovan is watching carefully. Louis measured him. Right to the body, a left hook to the jaw, and Schmeling is down. The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmeling is beaten in one round. The first time that a world heavyweight championship.
Louis had won a victory strong in symbolism. But there was more evidence of sport's new role when the two fighters came to play their part in the next chapter. When the Second World War began, the American government made the most of Louis's huge following to help the war effort.
That husky young Negro is the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Joe Louis, the boy who beat Max Schmeling. The Army can use that fighting spirit, and Joe Louis is now a corporal of cavalry, somewhere in the West.
German newsreels used Max Schmeling in just the same way.
Max Schmeling, Deutschlands populärster Boxer und ehemaliger Weltmeister, hat sich freiwillig zu den Fallschirmjägern gemeldet. Er steht in der Front seiner jungen Kameraden, die hier zu Fallschirmjägern ausgebildet werden.
For the duration, the war provided all the real-life conflict and drama people could handle. But sport was now deeply rooted in the lives of ordinary people across the world. After the war, it would be further exploited and commercialized. But it would still provide a sense of identity and emotional release. Sport had turned into one of the great passions of the century.